Lord Jesus Christ.
A story we agree to tell each other over and over till we forget that it's a lie. But what do we have left once we abandon the lie? Chaos. A gaping pit waiting to swallow us all. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder. Many who try to climb it fail, never get to try again. The fall breaks them, and some are given a chance to climb, but they refuse. They cling to the realm, or the gods, or love, illusions. Only the ladder is real. The climb is all there is.
That's just what Jesus said, sir.
Do you have a strong sense of skepticism, yet also a cowboy conspiracy theory sensibility? Are you a geek philosopher, enjoy imprinting parody and satire on any medium? Self-deprecate to the point your ego defecates? Do you believe in deconstructing reality while deeply mining your own being for alchemical gold and heartbreaking revelations? Do you see art and invention as the greatest kingmakers in any time of war or peace? Do you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rains of creation? Then you have come to the right place, here in the desert of the real, along with the ancient Gnostics and all other heretics of history.
Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright, that God may love thee. Speak the truth, always, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless and do no wrong. That is your oath.
Welcome to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always through the God above God.com. Welcome you lovers of the esoterica and Dionysian freethinkers. Welcome you modern day Tom Sawyers. Welcome you Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, you existentialist Galahads, you revenge of the myths, you words made on flesh. Welcome you shining crazy diamonds, oh the eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. Welcome you jaded mandarins, you rainbows in the dark, you kings of pain, you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars, you heroes of 1,000 Facebook profiles, champion eternals, you, the true seeker warriors of Kabir, you knights of Hypatia and Sophia paladins, welcome you seed of Seth, welcome you garage philosophers, hedge theologians, infernal poets, mad hatter inventors, red pill popping whores. Oh, welcome you EVA Unit 1 pilots on your Pacific rimming of the outer rectums of reality. Oh, welcome whoever you are, because you really are not. You're much, much better, on the cusp of doing so many wonders.
I will not make any deals with you. I've resigned. I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
Welcome. Make yourselves at home in order to finally reach that home of homes you forgot once upon a vanilla sky and once upon a Hotel California.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole.
I am Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. And so are you. I come to you in cyberspace from my meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting in the frigid and lawful dystopia of Chicago. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis and smell of Corinthians rising up through the air. This quote by Stephen Heller illustrates what I and you are all about. The difference between a mystic and a madman is that the mystic knows who not to tell. Except that we're beginning to tell the world of our gnosis, and the establishment is beginning to listen, to fear us. There are some things better left unsaid, but you can bet your sweet ass we're gonna say them anyway.
If the world that we are forced to accept is false and nothing is true, then everything is possible.
On the way to discovering what we love, we will find everything we hate, everything that blocks our path to what we desire.
Led us to our great show and first one of the year on this January 11th, the year of our Demiurge 2014. We continue our Christ Myth Theory series with a rising star in both mythicism and comparative religion. That is our astral guest, Raphael Lataster, who joins us in this eternal now to discuss his book, There Was No Jesus, There Is No God. Beyond the murky title, I'm still trying to decipher with my Irish brain. Raphael's book is an excellent summation of the Christ myth theory with many novel insights. A grand and skylark read, as you will see by a mesmeric interview, where Raphael takes down a varied group of fatigued scholars, from Bart Ehrman to William Lane Craig. For more information on Raphael and his heretical monkey shines, please visit this site, pantheismunites.org.
God will have his vengeance.
I think your God was afraid of me.
And check out our past episodes on the Christ Myth Theory on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. From an august and dangerous group of scholars and freethinkers that includes Robert M. Price, Acharya S., Richard Carrier, Tim Freak, David Fitzgerald, Hector Avalos, Joe Atwill, Tom Harper, and many others. You can find them at our Archive of Past Shows, YouTube, iTunes, or the Ninth Circle of Hell, where you'll find yourself soon because of your foolish curiosity.
I am the devil.
Your suffering will be legendary, even in hell.
Personally, I haven't focused much recently on the Christ myth theory. Or maybe I'm just less of a zealot. Maybe I'm just too busy discovering that I'm a myth, a metaphor, and never was historical to begin with. Or maybe it's time I told you I've been working for orthodoxy and Yaldi Baldi. That this entire time you've been exposed to orthodox radiation that will melt your mind away so we can place you in one of those government interim camps like you find in Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly. That would mean the show actually has a sizable audience, something no one will ever believe.
That's now. In an hour, he could have total recall.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. The Aeon Byte 2.0 initiative, including Voices of Gnosticism, has been slightly crippled because of so many events, including the death of my brother Sean, the birth of my son Sebastian, and several financial Ragnaroks. Hopefully 2014 will be more stable, or I might have to go on eBay and sell my anal virginity for extra shekels.
Take a big step back and literally fuck your own face!
But thank you who support this Hobbit podcast on a weekly basis all throughout the year. Like Mythicist Milwaukee, Agustine, Zoe, Marcus, Emily, Don, Roger, and the Westboro Baptist Church. That wasn't supposed to make the visible list. Anywho, your support is appreciated and continued support is essential. And always feel free to touch me a line if you want, as do many of you champion Eternals. You can email me at Miguel@thegodabovegod.com.
Do you even listen to yourself when you talk?
I drift in and out.
But enough of my Pandoric drivel. As long and extroverted and unnecessary as the film adaptations of The Hobbit. as original as a Scooby-Doo backdrop, led us to the interview with Raphael Lataster on his new book, There Was No Jesus, There Is No God. Why not just end with an excellent quote on myths, as it is our topic today, from Robert Artisan. A person realizes that dreams are free-range visions, undomesticated perceptions. In the human social world, we try to categorize and rationalize and explain everything away. This quote-unquote world of our waking is very similar to the dream world, an extension of it, made from the same sacred stuff of power. But we spend our time domesticating it. When we dream, however, we get power straight, untamed, wild, surreal. Myth springs from the undomesticated visionary capacity of our experiencing beings. To re-myth, one starts by getting fed up with the domesticated quality of everyday worldly perceptions, and the ways that domestication has been used so cruelly to divide and conquer and enrich the greediest of our species.
What do all men with power want? More power.
From the revulsion springs an urge to withdraw, not unlike Buddha taking to the forest, and then it gives way to a spirit of exploration. No longer obsessed with having to have things quote-unquote comfortable or fit into the ordinary categories of explanation. A person's mind relaxes, becomes comfortable with uncertainty, becomes open to the untamed powers arising in experience. No judgments have to be made about them. Their wisdom imparts itself when a person lets them be what they are. Then, a narrative, a new sort of narrative, has a possibility of arising. The world creator can be an animal or a waterfall or a doorway, without this strange insight having to be fit into a greater, overarching explanation of the world. The ancestors can be stones or strange songs, like that eternal soundtrack to the counterculture that you and I are. Welcome, oh welcome.
The earth is evil. We don't need to grieve for it. Nobody will miss it. All I know is life on earth is evil. There may be life somewhere else, but there isn't. How do you know? Because I know things. Oh yes, you always imagined you did. I know we're alone. I don't think you know that at all. 678. The bean lottery. Nobody guessed the amount of beans in the bottle. No, that's right. But I know. 678.
But what does that prove?
That I know things. And when I say we're alone, we're alone. Life is only on Earth, and not for long.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined by Raphael Lataster to discuss his book, There Was No Jesus, There Is No God, a scholarly examination of the scientific, historical, and philosophical evidence and arguments for monotheism. How are you doing today, Raphael?
Hi, Miguel. Doing very well. Thank you very much for that excellent introduction. I have to apologize for that rather long title there for you.
Oh, no problem. You got to get these taglines in our internet age. But so why don't we start more or less with the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write your book. There was no Jesus, there is no God.
Sure. Well, I had a career change. I've always been interested in the academic world, and I've always been interested in the Bible and Christianity and religion. And as I became more and more liberal, I used to be a fundamentalist Christian. As I became more liberal, I decided that I should probably pursue these sorts of studies, and I did my Master of Arts in Religious Studies at the University of Sydney. And that thesis was done on the very controversial topic of Jesus mythicism, the broad idea that maybe there was no historical Jesus behind the obviously fictional biblical Jesus. At least to many scholars, it's obviously fictional. And I somehow got through that ordeal, managed to tackle that very controversial topic, and the thesis was pretty well received. Obviously, not by fundamentalist Christians, but it's a respected and well received thesis. And I thought I would like to publish it, but I decided not to go down the traditional publishing route. I thought I would rather go for a more general audience and make this in a form that more people would be able to make use of, that more people would be able to understand and afford. Because with the traditional scholarly publishing routes, you often get books that are quite technical and expensive also. So I thought I want to reach more of a general audience. I want to limit what I research to issues that people in the public would be interested in. So I thought that would be the ideal way for me to go.
Yes, and it seems today, and let me know your thoughts on this, and your book, of course, touches upon this, that even in secular academia and atheist circles, the Jesus myth or the Christ myth theory, there's a lot of resistance. I think you put a great quote in your book by Upton Sinclair, who said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding." Is that what's happening even in the secular academia?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was quite shocked, actually, the challenges that I faced when I started and even ongoing. I was really taken by that because I studied in the secular field of studies in religion. I believe in America it might be called religious studies. Now, this field is supposed to be the obviously secular counterpart to, say, theology, or even biblical studies. Theology is meant to be the insider view of religion. Religious studies or studies in religion is meant to be the outsider view of religion. So I didn't expect to face such opposition. But indeed, as per the quote you mentioned, the quotation, it is very difficult to do such work in the academic fields when so much of the support and so much of the funding directly or indirectly does come from powerful Christian churches. This leads to other issues as well, which I hope will become a big part of my academic career, if I have one, because the topics I choose to research might entail that I'm committing career suicide. But I'm very much a fan of being transparent with regards to alternative religions and alternative God conceptions. I think that Christianity, Christian theism in general, is very privileged in the university system, and I think that's not right. That's not what academia is about, what academic freedom is all about. I think we should consider alternatives as well, and such alternatives include, say, pantheism and its variants, deism, and even other views of God.
Yeah, we can certainly touch upon those in a little bit, but also, Raphael, this resistance comes from, again, at least here in the West, from secular circles. And the main one, the one who spearheads it, or the most famous one, would be Bart Ehrman, whose book, Was There a Historical Jesus?, sort of slams back at the Jesus mythicist. Why do you think this is?
Sure. Well, there's a number of reasons. I actually had an appendix you might be interested in the master's thesis that didn't actually get into the book, and that is basically considering the motives of the various people in this discussion. And it didn't make it into the book because I thought it might not be as interesting, but it still has some noteworthy points, such as even secular scholars such as Bart Ehrman and others, have ulterior motives for positing a historical Jesus. One is, of course, the salary issue that we've already mentioned. I mean, if you look at where Bart Ehrman works and who his students are, it makes sense. If he's going to completely write off Jesus, he probably wouldn't have a job. So that obviously makes sense. But I think ego comes into it as well. it can be very difficult to admit that you are wrong, especially if it is something that you've been doing or asserting for decades. This is a common problem we find also with people in the clergy. I've had one reader of the book privately email me and say that they really enjoyed it and that they're actually a pastor. And I was thinking, how does a pastor enjoy my book? I thought, well, it is possible because it's about the evidence. It doesn't really say much about faith, and it's not really anti-religious or even anti-Christian. But the reason was that this pastor no longer believes. This pastor is an atheist, but they're sort of stuck. They've been doing their job for so long now. It's really difficult not only to overcome the ego, but once you've done that, once you've overcome the ego and admitted, hey, I'm wrong, or I'm probably wrong, or I might plausibly be wrong, then there's still the practical issue of what do you do with your life now? And that is a very difficult thing to get around, is that these people who now no longer believe, but their whole reason for being was based on such beliefs, that is very difficult to deal with. They now have to try and figure out what they're going to do with their life, what they're going to do with their time, how they're going to make a living, and be able to look at themselves in the mirror as well. So, but another massive reason, I think, why atheists in general don't jump on board the Jesus myth theory. I prefer to call it the Jesus myth theory because to most secular people, Christ, of course, already is a myth. The whole issue is whether Jesus is a myth also, the so-called historical Jesus. And I think the big reason, or a few reasons, are that it's not necessary. It's not necessary for atheists to think that there was no Jesus. I'm an atheist and I'm comfortable with that label, unlike so many of my peers. But my atheism does not rely on there not having been a historical Jesus. It really is irrelevant to that issue. It can also be irrelevant to whether you would be a Christian or not. There's obviously different ways you can be religious and thus different ways you can be a Christian. So I think one of the reasons why so many atheists are not willing to jump on board these Jesus ahistoricity theories is that it's simply not necessary in order to be an atheist. And another issue that's related to that is that when you're an atheist, you already are going against what seems to be the majority. And it just seems like here's another battle that we don't have to get involved in. Why would we throw ourselves in this battle, which is highly controversial and really doesn't seem to impact things much? Why would we involve ourselves in that battle? So you might ask, why did I involve myself in that battle? Well, I had to do something for my master's thesis. I had to do something before my PhD. And I thought this was a really interesting question, a really interesting historical question, whether or not it has any effect on religion or atheism. I thought it was in itself a really interesting question, and that it could expose the spurious methods of religious and even non-religious scholars within the academic system. So I thought that was I thought we could get quite significant information out of this project, and I think that's been done.
And in your book, Raphael, you do a masterful job breaking down the, let's say, apologetics of Bart Ehrman and others on the historical existence of Jesus. And on this show, Aeon Byte, we've had the honor of having Robert Price, we've had Bart Ehrman, we've had other mythicists that you mentioned in your book. So I'd like to maybe talk about some of the points that other mythicists haven't really delved in or sort of missed, and you do focus very well in your book. One of them is Bart Ehrman and his idea of the Aramaic undertext or sources in the Gospels. What's your answer to that?
That is a great topic for discussion. That is one of the things about Bart's recent book that made me just want to throw the book against the wall. It's unbelievable that for such educated people, for such people that portray themselves as authorities compared to the rest of us mere mortals, it is incredible that so much of their case for the historical Jesus revolves around hypothetical sources, that are sources that don't exist. We don't know if these sources existed at all. We don't know what exactly they said. We don't know what the intent of these sources were. We don't know who wrote them, and we don't know when they wrote them. So it is absolutely disgraceful in doing a historical analysis that so much importance is placed on sources that don't exist and may never have existed. That is obviously completely counterintuitive when it comes to history, and you're supposed to be making probabilistic determinations about the sources that you actually have access to. Another thing that irks me about that whole strategy Ehrman uses with his hypothetical sources, and you might find this quite funny actually, is that he specifies that these hypothetical sources behind the Gospels, they go to within a year or two of Jesus's life. As many of you will know, the Gospels are written a few decades after Jesus's supposed lifetime. And that can be a problem, especially when you consider earlier sources such as the epistles of Paul. So that's why Ehrman partly refers to these hypothetical sources. And he incredibly dates these sources that don't exist to within a year or two of Jesus's death. I'm sitting there thinking, if you're going to make up sources, and you're going to make up so many sources as Ehrman has done, why don't you date them to within Jesus's lifetime? Why would you date them to within 1 or 2 years of his death? In fact, if you're going to do that, why not just say that you've got fake sources that come from Jesus's own mouth? Of course, I think the answer to that may be that that the likes of Ehrman just want to give it an air of plausibility. It might seem too unreasonable, but if that's unreasonable, I don't see why we should simply accept that his fake sources go to within a year or two of Jesus's death either.
And Raphael, for the listener that might not be familiar, what's a couple of these sources that Ehrman uses?
Well, that's part of the problem is that we simply don't know. But there is the source of Q, which is often put forth and is quite well established within biblical scholarship. And I say quite well in a very, very loose meaning of that phrase. It's very much accepted that Q exists, and Q is meant to be a source document for some of the gospel books. But even in that case, Q generally does not give historical details about Jesus. It seems to be, if it exists at all, it seems to be more of a sayings document, much like the Gospel of Thomas, which is in its own right a very interesting document that could very well show the evolution of the gospel story. But most of the hypothetical sources, by reasons of necessity, are not actually named by Ehrman. He just asserts that they exist and that there's a lot of them and that they're very early. But what exactly they are, what's in them, who wrote them, when they wrote them, we don't know, which is obviously the case for sources that just don't exist.
Well, he's a bestseller. He can say anything he wants, and we just have to...
That is a real shame.
Yeah. Well, I guess the $64,000 question, as they say here in the United States, Raphael, is why did Christianity begin? I mean, for example, Earl Doherty, he writes it basically came out of the mystery religion. Paul was part of this mystery religion of Jesus crucified in another dimension. And later on, as it happens with legends, we add history to this. How do you see Christianity's beginning?
Sure. I have a lot of time for Doherty's theories. I think they're generally quite good, and a lot of what I've come up with either is just reiterating what he said or seems to derive from that, seems to jive very well with his theories. I think it's definitely the case that we don't need to posit a historical Jesus to explain the origins of Christianity or even the progression, the success, the evolution of Christianity. You see, it seems that Christianity derives pretty much from the gospel accounts. I mean, that's where we find the story of Jesus, whether you want to consider the so-called biblical Jesus or the so-called historical Jesus. It's all pretty much about the gospel stories. Now, these gospel documents are supposedly written decades after Jesus' life. Now, if the whole of Christianity stems from these documents, then it doesn't seem obvious at all that we actually need a historical Jesus. All we need are the gospel stories. So all we needed are a bunch of people that wrote down some stuff that didn't happen, or that took some basic historical facts and greatly exaggerated them, greatly put all these mythical claims around them. We don't actually need a historical Jesus. And that's only to explain the beginnings. Christianity really only took off a few centuries after Jesus's supposed life, and there were big political motivations for that. But it's not at all the case that you need a historical Jesus to explain the origins and success of Christianity. And in fact, to do so would seem to be counterintuitive, at least if it's a Christian saying this, because then how do you explain the rise of other religions? I mean, is the rise of other religions explained by the fact that all the claims that they make are true as well? I mean, it just seems completely illogical and counterintuitive.
What is a couple of arguments from historicists beyond Bart Ehrman that completely drive you crazy? If you can think of the two that just get to you.
Yeah, one big one is that a lot of Jesus historicity scholars read the epistles of Paul with gospel-tainted glasses. And most people do that. Most believers do that. You open up the Bible, New Testament in any case, you open up the New Testament, and it starts off with the Gospels. It starts off with the Gospel of Matthew, who doesn't even give us the first Gospel. Now, this sort of gives the impression that the Gospels may be the earlier documents. They seem to be talking about the earliest events, but it is the case that the epistles of Paul are actually the earliest documents. So what I find so offensive, actually, in academia is when the scholar, it's not just a typical believer that does this, but when the scholar, the biblical scholar, reads the epistles of Paul, and they've got all the information about Jesus in their head that they've already got from the Gospels. And everything they see about Paul is influenced by what they think they already know about Jesus from the Gospels. Now, given that Paul gives us the earliest documents, we really need to concede that maybe the Gospels are just exaggerating and elaborating on Paul's basic Christian framework. Maybe Paul is the person that's pretty much inventing Christianity, and we can talk about his heavenly Jesus, and it is the gospel authors who try and fill in the blanks, who try and say, no, this is actually a historical character, and they make up all these historical details. So that I find quite disturbing is the hesitation in reading Paul as Paul, in reading Paul without what we think we know from the gospel stories. And I think if that is actually done, we get some very, very significant conclusions. And I faced that directly during the construction of my master's thesis. When one of my supervisors raised this, they directly rose this issue, saying that, well, because I'm talking about Paul describing a heavenly Jesus, and one of my supervisors was saying, well, that's to be expected because by the time Paul's writing, Jesus is already dead. Jesus has already ascended to heaven. So obviously he's going to be talking about a heavenly Jesus. But of course, if Paul's got the earliest writings and the Gospels are exaggerating Paul's claims and they're building on Paul's basic framework for Christianity, it might be the case that Jesus actually started as a heavenly Jesus, which is obviously more easily associated with a completely mythical Jesus, and that it is the later documents, the Gospels, that try and historicize Jesus, that try and put Jesus in a historical place and time, which Paul actually never does. Now, another issue I have with this type of research, with the quest for the historical Jesus, is the use of the criteria of authenticity. These are a bunch of tools basically used by the Bible scholar or the historical Jesus scholar to try and find out what it is that Jesus actually said or did. Now, one overarching problem I have with the criteria as a whole is that they pretty much assume that Jesus existed. They don't seem like they would be very helpful in asking the question if Jesus existed at all. They only seem to apply if you already assume that Jesus exists, and then you can try and find out, well, what did he really say? What did he really do? But if I'm trying to find out whether Jesus existed or not, it doesn't seem that these tools would be applicable. Now, on on a more detailed note, I think that a lot of the criteria are actually quite poor, or they're at least not used properly. They're not used consistently. One of them is the criterion of embarrassment, or criterion of double dissimilarity. Basically, this says that if something in the Jesus story, something in the Gospels, for example, would seem embarrassing to the author, or would seem very different from early Christian beliefs, then it's probably true, because why would someone make it up if it's embarrassing or if it's dissimilar to their religious beliefs? Now, there's a lot of problems with this. This is a very speculative way of thinking. Now, it is not obvious at all that what we find in the Gospels would be embarrassing to early Christians, for the simple fact that, early Christians, who was writing it? Seeing as the Christian faith derives from the Gospels, I don't see how you can possibly think that whatever the Gospel says would be embarrassing to the early Christian. These are the people that are writing the Gospels, and these are the people that are influencing others to become Christians. So it doesn't seem obvious at all that you can really identify embarrassing portions of the text, nor is it the case that something, if you really did find something that was imperative or counterintuitive, nor is it the case that that must necessarily be truth conducive. I mean, that's absolutely ludicrous. I use the same example to try and prove that there must be some form of Harry Potter that really existed, because if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books, the author J.K. Rowling is a muggle. I have it on good faith that she is a muggle. Now, that's a non-magical human being. But in the early parts of the first Harry Potter book, J.K. Rowling describes Harry Potter's muggle relatives in a very negative light. Why would she do that when she's a muggle herself? It must be true.
Very good point. Very good point. Raphael, and of course this would beg the question, if Paul is the architect of what would become Christianity, at the same time, Paul admits that there are already churches all over the Mediterranean when he is converted and when he is spreading his word. So what was going on? Was it some sort of weird Jesus cult? What was Paul getting himself into? Or part of a lineage, perhaps, or a stream?
Sure. That's another reason, the fact that Paul is talking about other churches, that's another reason why so many scholars are quite hesitant to consider that Paul is basically describing the earlier form of Christianity and that the Gospels are exaggerating the claims, because he's referring to other churches, and that may have been the case of, say, the Gospels basically giving us the true story. But it could also be the case that there were alternative early Christianities that are very different from what we see in the Gospel account. And that actually is becoming increasingly supported when we look at all the historical sources. It is becoming more and more evident, and Bart Ehrman was one of the scholars to do such important work as well. It's becoming more and more evident that there were many different types of Christianities in the very early days. Now, it could very well be the case that there were many different types of Christianities during what may be alleged to be the time frame of Jesus's life. And Arthur Droge, I think, also basically argues for that as well by contrasting this with another medieval figure, Ned Ludd, that is widely known to be mythical, but also had a number of origins, a sort of poly-origins idea. It's not like there was one particular idea that kicked it off. And that might be the case with Jesus as well, that there were all these different groups, and somehow they came together, or one became dominant, which eventually would become the Roman Catholic Church, and pretty much wiped out all the other groups. When we find that there are very, very many different types of Christianities back in the very early days of the church with rabbit ears, back in the early days of the church, then I think it becomes more plausible that maybe Jesus was not a historical character at all, because I wonder if in the very early days of the church, people couldn't agree on such things as whether Jesus was God or not, whether he had some divinity to him or not, whether he was actually a fleshly person or not, whether he was on earth or not, whether he even really existed or not. I think if they couldn't agree back in the very early days of the church, I think that's very telling. I think that's a good indication that there probably wasn't a historical Jesus, and really it's only one stream of Christianity that became dominant and became Christianity as we know it today.
And Raphael, what arguments, or in the Christ myth theory, or as you call it, the Jesus myth theory, what do you see as perhaps some of it, the weakest part of the argument, or are there any arguments that you see that make you give pause and say, okay, this is a good argument for the historicity of Jesus?
The weakest, it wouldn't be just one particular issue. I think it depends on how the Jesus myth theorist presents their case. I think there can be a lot of wrong ways to go about it. For instance, focusing a lot on the mythical aspects of Jesus Christ, I find that to be very, very... I should explain what that is, basically. The idea of the pagan parallels, the idea that many of your audience may be familiar with the Zeitgeist documentary, the idea that so many aspects of Jesus' life in the gospel story seem to echo myths, basically, stories from other religions and much older religions. And that's true. There's a lot of motifs in the Jesus story. I can't believe that scholars try and downplay this. It is very obvious. It has been known, not just for centuries, it has been known for millennia that there are so many aspects of the Jesus story, of the Christ story, that seem to derive from much older religions and mythologies. That is an established fact. Even early Christians admitted that, and we've got the sources to justify that. Now, I think if the Jesus mythicist is going to present an argument that largely revolves around that, I don't find that particularly convincing, because for me, if I'm thinking, okay, the typical Bible scholar wants to say there's a historical Jesus, then all this talk of the pagan parallels would seem to be more relevant to the Christ. And we already know that Christ is a myth. It doesn't follow that there could not have been a historical Jesus behind all those myths. So I think we need to be very careful about the importance we place on certain bits of evidence and lines of thinking. Another thing that I would find as well, it's very important how you frame it, is the lack of evidence. There indeed is a great lack of primary source evidence for Jesus, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a Jesus. It just means that we don't have the evidence for that person. Of course, we don't have evidence for so many people that existed in history. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. That also doesn't mean that they did exist. So I think it's very important how the whole case is framed, and I think it's also important that we be quite subtle. I'm very open about, although I'm becoming more known because of this research that I've done, I don't aggressively assert that there wasn't a Jesus. I think probably there wasn't a Jesus, but I don't assert that there definitely wasn't one, nor do I think it actually necessary in regards to being a vocal critic of Christianity. So I think that the biggest problems, the biggest weaknesses in any Jesus myth theory is basically how it's framed, how the conclusion is put forth, what sort of conclusions they come up with. And I guess it would be good to also talk about the other side, what would be the most impressive case of Jesus mythicism. And I think that basically the most impressive part of it, of such cases, would be the evolution of the story. When you put the sources in order, and when you consider other sources as well, such as the writings of Philo of Alexandria, that seems to give some sort of a heavenly Christ blueprint for Paul, although it has a different name, it's called the Logos. I think when you do that, you definitely seem to have a much better case for Jesus's ahistoricity than just simply saying, this God also was raised from the dead, and that God also had a divine birth. I think if we're talking about the historical Jesus, it's much more impactful to talk about this seeming evolution of the story. So I think that would be the most ideal way to go about it. But it's all relevant. I mean, all this information helps. It's just important how it's all framed, and it's important that we try and be a bit subtle with the conclusions that we draw from all this evidence as well.
And of course, you were talking about the Logos, and in your book you touch upon Philo of Alexandria, of course, influenced Paul and so many other of the Mediterranean cultic religions. But so, how do you see the Gnostics playing into this?
I think that the Gnostics play a massive role when it comes to trying to discover the historical Jesus, trying to discover the origins of Christianity. What I find so interesting is that Gnosticism predates Christianity. So it's very easy for an outsider like myself to think, oh, well, maybe Christianity simply derived from Christian Gnosticism, which derived from Gnosticism. So it seems to fit quite well. Obviously, it wouldn't fit very well to someone that's been brainwashed their entire life to accept the gospel story that you basically had this marvelous human being and everything stems from his death. But that is just a story. There's no good evidence for that. But the Gnostic sort of idea I just laid out, that seems to be very, very plausible. And there are a lot of interesting aspects to Gnosticism and the whole idea of Marcion as well. Marcion, who's somewhat of a Gnostic, he seems to have given us the first New Testament canon. I mean, there's all these important Christians that were Gnostics, and it just seems completely written off by everyday believers and certain scholars, the importance that the Gnostics played in possibly kicking off the religion. I think there's a lot to be done there. The problem is that there's not a lot of sources, and there's a lot of bias against it, not only now, but also in the early days of the church, in the medieval times. The problem is that a lot of the Gnostic texts are simply gone. We don't have them anymore. It's very much the case that the stream of Christianity that became dominant is the one with the most support, is the one that has all the political support, financial support, and have most of their texts intact. Of course, the writings of other groups were often destroyed, and the few that weren't destroyed were just discredited and not included in the canon, so they're not known as much. So that's part of the problem with all this assumption of Jesus' historicity, is that it's very much influenced by the stream of Christianity that became dominant and even quite violent, and was very successful in knocking off all the alternatives.
And Raphael, you mentioned that the Gnostics predate Christianity, and even that is sort of controversial in the West. I mean, scholars like Elaine Pagels and so forth say that the Gnostics sort of there were a stream out of Christianity. What is your evidence that the Gnostics predate Christianity as we know it?
Well, I think the evidence is basically that there's no one Gnostic sect, there's no one Gnostic religion, and you definitely find Gnostic ideas and mystical religions long before Christianity. So I find it very surprising that people would think that Gnosticism comes after Christianity. I would be more inclined to believe that Christian Gnosticism may have come after Christianity, but I think it may have actually predated Christianity as we know it. But Gnosticism itself is heavily influenced by Plato and the mystery religions, and these concepts, of course, existed centuries before Christianity and so-called Christian Gnosticism. So I don't find that convincing at all to say that Gnosticism comes after Christianity and is influenced by it. I don't accept that at all.
And you have some interesting ideas on pantheism. Could you tell us about that, Raphael?
Certainly. Well, this is getting to Gnosticism again. There are certain Gnostic ideas that say there's a shard of divinity within all of us, and I find that idea fascinating, because what strikes me about monotheism, about classical theism, is the idea of this dualism, that there's a big divide between the divine and the mundane, and we mere mortals, we're just so inferior to God. Now, when you have these pantheistic concepts saying, well, actually the divinity is within us, the divinity is us, I think, wow, this is an incredible unifying concept. Now, I'm a true outsider because I don't believe this either. I am not a believer, basically. I am an atheist, and although atheism is compatible with pantheism, I believe, I don't believe in pantheism. But I think pantheism is a very positive and unifying God conception, and its various models as well. Pantheism is a very robust view of God because there are so many different forms of pantheism, and some of them are quite interesting and exciting. And I'm making the argument now in my doctoral work that many forms of pantheism are actually more plausible than theism. So this idea that we are God or we are part of God, I find that to be very, very practical as well. I think if everyone's going to be religious, I'd much rather that they were pantheists than, say, Christians or Muslims who have a very strict view of the world, a very exclusivist view of the world, that there's one true faith and that they must subjugate all the others and must dominate the world. I think that pantheism is very unifying and has benefits for people. It has sociological benefits, but also has ecological benefits as well. It would seem to encourage that people respect their environment if they would see that not only they have the divinity within, but that everything, that every living thing and even every non-living thing should be treated with respect. I think that is such an evolved view of the world. And yet, how can that be an evolved view? That is possibly one of the oldest religious concepts. It seems to be very similar to animism, which obviously predates Christianity and theism to some, I don't know, for some millennia. So I find it fascinating, and I don't think enough scholars are talking about it. As I said, Christian theism and theism in general is very much privileged in the academic world, and I want to be one of the scholars that bucks that trend. I want to look at these alternatives to theism, and in my research so far, I'm finding that they're actually not only very positive, that there are these practical benefits, but I'm finding that they're actually more plausible than the more traditional theistic concepts as well.
And Raphael, the second part of your book, There Is No God, you take to task the Christian apologetics on the existence of God, and of course you bring up the work of William Lane Craig, who's sort of the champion of this movement. What are again a couple of arguments for the existence of the Old Testament God or the Christian God that drive you crazy and are easily to shoot down?
Yes, I definitely focus on the philosophical arguments for God's existence in the second part of the book, especially, as you said, William Lane Craig. I thought that he is generally seen as the best they have. So I thought if I'm going to go after someone, I might as well go after the best. Now, this may be disputed by professional philosophers, of course, but basically the more esteemed philosophers of religion, the more esteemed Christian philosophers don't really offer anything much better than what Craig offers anyway. Now, these arguments include the Kalam cosmological argument and also the fine-tuning argument. There's also the moral argument. I find the Kalam argument very interesting because it makes so many assumptions that it shouldn't really be taken seriously as an argument. And a lot of them, the assumptions have to do with the fact that the universe had a beginning. He has two main strategies for doing this. He says we have evidence. So he's got the empirical strategy of proving that the universe had a beginning. And he basically refers to Big Bang cosmology. Now, there's a lot of problems with that because cosmology is admittedly very speculative. There's just a lot we don't know about the universe. So it would seem that if you're going to make an evidential first cause argument, it's going to be basically a God of the gaps argument because there's just so much ignorance here. We don't know what actually happened. And some of the reasons, there's so many. I mean, I'm doing this for my doctoral work, so I'm sure that's going to be very interesting for you all to check out when that's ready. But there's so many problems with Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, so many problems in asserting that the universe began to exist. For instance, Big Bang cosmology doesn't actually say that the universe had a beginning. It says that based on the expansion of the universe, it seems that there was a point of this expansion. There was a beginning to the expansion. So there's already a problem right there. Why would we equate the beginning of the expansion to the beginning of the universe itself? That's obviously not a logical thing to do. Now, Big Bang cosmology theorizes that there was a singularity. We don't actually know that the singularity was there. But what if it's the case that singularity was actually the remnant of a previous universe, such as the cyclic or oscillating models of the universe? Or what if that singularity is itself eternal, much like how God is said to be eternal? So basically, we don't know. We don't have the evidence that the universe began to exist. And there's a lot of theories now in cosmology about multiverses that completely turn this idea on its head. Craig also has an a priori strategy for showing that the universe began to exist. That's basically to try and prove that infinities, infinites can't exist. And his only real proof of that infinites don't exist, and therefore that you can't have infinite events in time, and therefore you can't have an infinitely old universe. His only real proof for that is to give us an example of how ridiculous the concept of infinity is. He gives us the example of Hilbert's Hotel and shows that with various manipulations of the infinite guests in the infinite rooms of the hotel, that the concept of infinity seems ridiculous. But I don't. Many philosophers don't find that convincing at all, because it's not obvious why manipulations of guests in a hotel should have anything to do with whether it's possible to have infinite events in time. There's also a theory of time that is much more popular than Craig's assumed A theory of time that renders the whole first cause argument unnecessary, because if the B theory of time or some sort of eternalist view of time is true, then nothing has a beginning. Everything is eternal. So the Kalam cosmological argument is unfortunately very popular and very much talked about, but it really shouldn't be. It's simply not a good argument. Another point of Craig's case, and basically the case for theism in general, that I don't like, I've already hinted at, is this fact that there are alternatives such as pantheism. Now, for instance, if we consider this first cause argument, there's nothing there that rules out certain forms of pantheism. Why must it be the theistic God that did it? Why couldn't it have been a pantheistic God that kickstarted the universe? So they don't really deal with these issues. Theism just seems to win by default, and I'm definitely going to be making a push to show that that is not the case. There are alternatives, and they may be just as or even more plausible than theism, which is just so privileged by most scholars.
Yes, and the first half of your book, Raphael, you take a very even tone. You're calm, but in the second one, it seems I can see you pulling your hair, and you're kind of losing your temper with these apologists, especially, all these arguments, especially the one saying, well, without God, we cannot be moral beings, and you're just going, ah!
Well, sure, although I'm an atheist, and I'm a vocal atheist, and I'm trying to promote myself as such, and I would definitely like to debate famous apologists like William Lane Craig, I am not anti-religion per se, or even anti-Christian, and I find it offensive for those other believers, for those other types of religious people, that this Christian view, or this evidentialist Christian view, is so privileged. There's a lot more to religion than these evidentialist cases that really don't go anywhere. And there's obviously a lot more to religion too than the assumption of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God that is separate to us. There's a lot of pagans and New Age people out there as well that would seem to have a more pantheistic view of the world. And I think it's disgraceful that their views are just simply put to the side, while there are people like Craig trying to argue that Christian religion is very rational. I think that's definitely not correct. So yeah, I do find that frustrating, and I think that's part of the reason why I definitely want to promote and argue for the plausibility of these alternative God concepts, despite the fact that I actually am an outsider and I don't hold to any of these views.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Raphael. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your book.
Thank you very much, Miguel. It has been my pleasure to be here, and hopefully we can discuss my follow-up in future.
Oh, yes. Let's certainly get you on.
Cool. Thank you very much.